I'm Luke Fretwell, and this is the GovFresh podcast. In December of 2019, a small ad hoc team assembled for a 90-day experimental project. Called California Alpha, its goal was to help the state rethink government digital service delivery. Its members, picked from government and private sector, had never collectively worked together. Their mission was to create, in 3 months, a culture and product that embodied a new way of delivering services to Californians, one that focused on designing for user needs and challenged the status quo of digital delivery in state government. This is the story of California Alpha, why it was stood up, how it worked, and the resulting impact it had on the government digital ecosystem inside the state and beyond. This is a GovFresh podcast series on California Alpha, where I speak with Angie Quirarte, who played a key role in its creation and then led the project's work. In this episode, Angie and I discuss setting the California Alpha Foundation. Can you start off talking about what Alpha was for those who aren't familiar with the concept?
Alpha was one of the most transformational initiatives that I've had the honor of working on. It was essentially a proof of concept that really pushed the California state government into experimenting with a new culture and rethinking the way in which we, as public servants, delivered services to the public through digital means. It started out by rethinking ca.gov as a front door of public services for Californians and going beyond that and really pushing the needle around how do we deliver a better experience overall, but also rethink the way in which we work and how we approach in the delivery of that experience. Do we have the right team in place? Are they empowered to talk to actual users of that service? And how do we come together and really just build a new approach in getting things done?
And so, nothing in government happens overnight. Can you give a high-level timeline? I think it was like 2016 to 2019 or something around there. Can you give kind of a high-level timeline of the things that happened the things that occurred that made Alpha happen?
Yeah. At the time, I was assistant secretary for digital engagement. And so in my role, I worked quite a bit with the Department of Technology and its Office of Digital Innovation at the time, and really redesigning that office and pulling together what I would consider like foundational data and digital infrastructure that support that service. So that includes pulling together an open source policy and working through the implementation of that policy, establishing and reinforcing the open data program and policy and platform, right? Like making sure that the team was staffed to support that program as a service and that we were constantly engaging agencies in posting their data on the portal. We also worked through another policy that basically cataloged the domain name. So at the time, we were sitting on hundreds of domain names that were unutilized and made no sense to the general public as to why you would have, for example, Vision 2020 was actually a domain name requested for like the Department of Fish and Wildlife for like their
Of course
Vision 2020 report, right? Like you would think ICE, for example, I don't know. And so we cleaned up a lot of domain names, established a process, a policy, and a product in place to be able to allow and enable agencies to request domain names and maintain those. And also held, for example, CIOs accountable to the domain names that were associated with their department. And did quite a bit as well to just establish more of a community of practice. So around that time, as I mentioned, I was digital engagement. So I did quite a bit of work to also connect with external partners and organizations. At the time, Code for America was doing quite a bit of work in engaging the local brigades, for example. Um, and so we did some, actually, you and I also worked on this when we were working with DMB. We did some experimenting and doing some user testing with folks that go to the DMV and services. We got them to come and criticize the website at the time and basically give us feedback on how their experience could be better. So I would say overall, we spent, again, from 2016 to 2019, at least through that period, spent a lot of time building the foundation, making sure that we had the policies in place that reinforced that ecosystem. We also did an update to the design. It wasn't a design system, it was a web template, right? So like part of what Alpha did was it led to the evolution from just a template to really think about government services more of a system, which led to the birth of the design system. And we had the policies in place, the products in place, the process of the piece essentially, and the people to support that broader foundation, which I think was literally foundational in making sure that Alpha had a strong starting point when we kicked it off in the fall of 2019.
Yeah, you mentioned the people, and I know, that's really important in making things like this happen, especially in a political environment. Can you talk about that dynamic, who the people were, what roles they had, what role they played in championing, kind of making all of this come together?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Jerry was governor at that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this was the last term for Governor Jerry Brown, and he came in knowing specifically what he wanted, right? Like he had his own separate agenda, which primarily focused on the environment,
Which was not digital.
and not definitely like he did not care as much as I wanted to, as much as the inspired, naive, like early public servant Angie wanted Governor Jerry Brown to sign an executive order for open data. That was never going to happen in that environment. But what we did have was an agency secretary, so a cabinet level position. That was Maribel Thatcher, who is then one of the most respected and admired like public servants that I've ever had the privilege of working for. And she didn't quite have what I would say the lingo, but understood that it was important that we were working on innovation, that we cared about data, that we talked to people about the services and their experience. Like at the time, we didn't quite translate it to customer experience, for example, but we knew that it was an important value, I think, that we had to incorporate into our way of work in order to make government operations more effective, which is the agency that she was leading, which is where I also sat. And so Maribel and Stuart Drown, who was Deputy Secretary for Innovation and Accountability, he was technically my my boss. We basically pulled together the innovation agenda as well with our comms Deputy Secretary too. And I think that's actually a unique setup, I would say, because most organizations that I've engaged with really silo themselves between the IT shop, the comp shop, like the legal shop, what have you. And GovOps was so small, we had trust. And like I think we were really multidisciplinary in that way. Like we constantly engaged between the policy portfolio and the policy official, as well as with like the communications executive. And so Linda Gledhill was the Deputy Secretary for Communications at GovOps, and she was the one that first championed in partnership with Stu and I the first or one of the first redesigns of ca.gov during that time. And then separately, we had Mike Wilkening,
Mhm.
who was at the time Undersecretary of the California Health and Human Services Agency, as well as Tamara and Cheney, who were leading separately, like their own Office of Innovation within the context of Health and Human Services.
Mhm.
And so, whereas GovOps, which is where I sat, we were working on setting the foundation. The team at HHS with Mike and Tamara and Cheney and others were basically testing a lot of those concepts, which I think really, I would actually also argue was part of really setting the foundation. They gave a lot of the principles that we were trying to put into practice in that policy. They actually put those principles into practice within HHS. Um, and by the time that again Alpha came around, that was part of also building the ecosystem. We had not just partners on the outside, but also had partners within state government that were also trying out new ways of working, which I think gave it a really good balance. And then most importantly was also the folks at the Department of Technology, right? So CDT sat within GovOps. They are the ones that technically have the authority to set policy for other agencies to follow, at least the technology policy. And we had a team in place that had been supporting a lot of these products and services.
Mhm.
But as most departments of technology tend to they tend to get caught up in between, are we maintaining the
Yeah.
system or are we innovating, right? And so
Yeah.
like there's constant friction between just supporting the basics of making sure that we can actually like function
Yeah.
versus transformation. And so I know we're probably going to talk about it a little bit later, but I think we dealt a lot with that friction. And so I think part of our goal was to try to establish dedicated space and permission
Mhm.
for a group of public servants and and other experts to come together and really experiment outside of the responsibilities of maintaining critical systems that needed to be maintained, which I think was what led to both the Alpha, but then eventually creating the Office of Digital Innovation as a sister entity to the Department of Technology within GovOps.
Yeah. So there were two. It's a little confusing because there's two ODIs. There's ODI 1 and ODI 2.0, or a different version. Can you talk about what the Office of Digital Innovation was, the original Office of Digital Innovation? And
Yeah.
also something I know that they were key in maintaining, cultivating, and I know it was just sort of bringing together that community of practice. During the time that you set the foundation, was it Digital Service Network
Yeah.
was established. Can you talk about ODI 1.0 and
Yeah.
the Digital Service Network?
Yeah. So ODI point one was actually initially we're thinking about renaming it something else. It was like it was TEDdy, Technology Engagement and Digital Innovation. I think that's what we had
Yeah.
proposed of the teddy bear. Um and that's just not the name that stuck. But in any case, the original ODI essentially grouped together all of the policy, digital and data policy functions that I highlighted earlier. So
Mhm.
I brought together open source, open data, web standards, web accessibility, um, as well as CA.gov and a couple of government-wide, what I would consider like government-wide platforms.
Mhm.
And as part of that, again, in the process of setting the foundation, it was important for us to be able to kind of recalibrate and re-engage with the public servants that were working on the implementation of these policies. And so that's how initially it was a webmasters, essentially it was a webmasters gathering,
Mm.
and we reframed it and kicked it off as a digital services network,
Yeah.
uh, being more intentional around the naming, because again we wanted to be more than just webmasters. Like we wanted also the public servants that were attending these meetings to see themselves as being literally part of, just like, so you're just not maintaining, it's more than just maintaining a website, you're delivering a service.
Yeah.
Um, and so in reestablishing that network, we spent more time not just talking about the policies that were coming down the line, but engaging the public servants in the process and the development of that policy. And then also gathering essentially more of the needs that they had or maybe limitations that they had in their department to be successful in implementing the intent of the policies that we rolled out. So we became a more, I think, active and engaged community of practice, and it expanded beyond just the webmasters at that point. Then also more folks like the comms shops, for example, folks that work in communication started participating a bit more because it became more relevant to the work and the portfolios that they were overseeing.
Mm-hmm. So you have the ingredients for that were an open source policy, an open data policy, a web standards policy, and you inventoried the domains and you set up the digital services network.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the ingredients that helped you kind of set that foundation. And then politically, you had key folks, someone at the top, Ray Bell, who knew enough to connect the dots and then sort of empowered folks like you and Stuart to get the ball rolling and help build out ODI into more of a strategic digital agency. Is that
Yeah.
summarized? Okay.
Yeah. And
And
I think definitely the comms piece, I don't want to underemphasize that because
mhm,
Linda was the first champion of the redesign of CA.gov.
mhm,
And it was essentially Linda and I that were recreating and reframed the digital services network into what it is,
yeah.
or what it became at that time.
So what do you mean by comms? Like what role did Linda play and what do you mean by comms? Because I think people underscore
Yeah.
the importance of narrative, whether it's internal or external.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know what you did on the comms front that kind of helped facilitate this.
I think it was really bridging, whereas typically you have, again, your IT shop divided from your external communications folks. Like they're just the external comms, the folks that handle talking to the reporters and like have some influencing on the type of messaging that your website might want to have based on
Mhm.
whatever priorities your department might want to push out. I think what was unique about GovOps at the time is that it was like both Linda and Stuart were reporters.
Yeah.
Um, Stuart wearing the policy hat around innovation and accountability, Linda wearing the hat around like communications, both internal and external.
Mhm.
But both understood the value of just communication more broadly. And so I think we evolved to the point where CA.gov was more than just the website.
Mhm.
I think, and we might talk about this at some point, but the first redesign that at least I got to work on, sure, it still had like a lot of pretty pictures of California per se, but it started to move toward, well, is this actually what people need? Like we started to engage more with the analytics of the site to see
Mhm.
what people were looking for. And I think at least I haven't seen communication shops engage in that way with your like traditional, where you would consider now traditional digital service teams.
Yeah.
I think they usually operate in silo. And so what was again unique about this setup is that they were integrated from the start.
Mhm.
And like it was evolving to more of a digital service like team,
Yeah.
uh, based on the foundation of like you had your policy official and your communications like expert and executive like on board.
Yeah.
Um, I'll also say that Linda and I also got to work on the implementation of AB 434,
Mhm.
which it was a law that passed that basically mandated that departments self-attest that their websites were
Mhm.
accessible.
Yeah.
And so that was another part of work that we did as a precursor, essentially, to also the alpha, was engaging with the com shop, with the IT shop, and the implementation of AB 434. Also in partnership with our folks from the Department of Rehabilitation. The CIO there was critical and part of all the conversations and trying to set the foundation for that as well. So we had separately set up like an accessibility community of practice that was also integrated with the digital services network. So it was all interconnected. It was like intentionally set up that way.
Yeah. It's funny when the first time I met Stu, I don't know if he reached out to me or we met each other. He introduced himself to me at a Code for America summit, but we talked about kind of open culture, open
Yeah.
government, open data, open source, but generally like open culture. And I knew that he was a journalist, and so journalists get that type of stuff. And I think that when I was talking to him, I just thought, wow, this guy really gets sort of the open culture. And I think that that also gets underscored in these type of efforts, and that there's people, there's policies, there's all of these things, but having a cultural
Yeah.
component to it that aligns everybody is critical. And I don't like was there any of that set where y'all were like, okay, we're going to follow the open government directive that Obama issued? Or like, was there any point of reference that united everybody culturally, loosely, or formally or informally?
Again, I think GovOps at the time was brand new.
Hmm.
So you see a lot of norming around values when you establish a brand new organization.
Right.
And everyone that was part of the very beginning of GovOps, I think, valued that openness, a collaboration, right? Like we each respected our strengths
Hmm.
and complemented each other in our weaknesses. Like everyone that knows me knows that I hate to write the first draft. It just
Yeah.
takes longer to write the first draft. I'd rather just do the thing than write the
Mhm.
thing. Um, but that's where we excelled because Stu was amazing at writing just the first draft. Like he
Yeah.
just puts it on paper very clearly. Like so we complemented each other really well. In putting the vision together and then also just getting it done.
Yeah.
I think we referred a lot at that time to the work that was happening in the UK,
Mm.
right, and the government transformation taking place there, and that technology was playing a more prominent role in in the less traditional like government setup
Yeah.
of like your executives and your cabinet, for example, right? Like the fact that um yeah, it was more prominent at the time and or becoming more prominent. We were also coming out of the healthcare.gov chaos, right?
Mhm.
And like learning the lessons learned from the Obama time and that like in that era, establishing the US digital service and following the lessons learned from that. I really learned a lot more actually from inspired from the work that 18F did and how they were constantly blogging in the
Yeah.
open up their work. So we were taking those lessons learned as we were engaging with those teams at the time, um, because we saw we valued the same values in that
Hmm.
way, like openness, collaboration, and like focusing on meeting the needs of the people that we're serving.
Yeah. So there were definitely it was a vibe at that time. Open was a vibe in government at that time, both with the Open Government Initiative, the Open Government Directive, what UK was doing with open source, open data, and just being kind of, you know, pushing stuff to GitHub and just blogging a lot. So there was that kind of, external validation, like, hey, we could be doing this too. This is really cool.
Yeah,
So I think the challenge for governments now, and then as you mentioned with healthcare.gov, it was this forced sense of quote crisis, like we need to really change what we're doing because the way that we're doing it is wrong and it's setting us up for a potential, healthcare.gov of our own. So there were a lot of like external components that influence culture at that time that I think governments now are going to be challenged by maybe more so with the stuff with Doge pushing people to feel like there's this need to, work in a quote crisis mode or be more efficient. Um, but certainly the culture aspects, I think government's going to need to really
Yeah.
figure out and lean into more. Whereas with what y'all were doing at the time, um, it was just in the air,
Yeah.
open was in the
Yeah.
air. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I know we'll get to this at some point and you're about to ask me a different question, but like you brought up Doge, and I think the only reference that I'll address here is that where they might claim to be working in the open, I think when you contrast that with the way in which we actually did work in the open
yeah,
back in the day and in alpha, I it's just it is not what they say it is.
yeah,
Right? Like, and those that have been radically transparent and
mm,
like posting every GitHub issue and putting it in the board so people could track, and like we can have people engage and comment, and like and inviting people into the alpha space
mm,
to literally see what we were working on. Like there was a wide open window where you could see us working,
yep,
and us constantly blogging about it, like much like 18F had done at the time. I
yeah,
think the technologists that have been working in the public interest space truly understood that. And I don't know at some point when we lost it.
mhm,
It just feels like we lost some of that. Um, and I can only hope that we can get that back, because I do think that that level of openness, transparency, really also just breeds both accountability as well as collaboration. And we need that now more than
yeah.
ever.
Yeah, it breeds a sense of innovation, right? A sense of we can, experiment and not make a big deal of it. We can, work with each other in a very constructive way, um, and that is missing. I think, and we'll talk about this at some point. But for I think what impacted the momentum on it was COVID happened, and then you switch to crisis mode. And my theory on sort of civic tech or digital service is that the the shift to agile and delivery, it shifted all the way one way.
Mhm.
And it was all about that and product management and these sort of um, technology project management practices, and shifted all the way into one direction and left out sort of the cultural component of openness and collaboration and you know a sense of engagement with the public and government and the sense of civics. We kind of swung, there's a civic component to it, and then the digital service response, crisis response, like shifted completely in the opposite direction. It was all about just let's deliver, we're
Mhm.
delivering. And I think with the work that Alpha was doing, um, COVID sort of stopped that and shifted it over to, it was sort of the healthcare.gov for the world.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but all right. So the last thing, if you were going to give someone advice who's thinking about, you know, standing up a digital service for their organization, you know, what what advice would you have for them?
That's a great question. I would say find your champion, um, someone that's able to cover for you, that can help remove levers, that can give you political cover and give you both like also permission to just experiment and do it in a safely way. I'd encourage you to, we just talked about this, like work in the open from the start,
Mhm.
like being intentional around what is the thing that we are rethinking why do we think it's not working, and like what are we gonna do to test out if it works different in which way, and like what did we learn when we did the thing, like when we experimented with it. Um, I would say also just start with the people that are already there.
Mm-hmm.
I think especially right now, like the messaging and disparaging that's happening around like public service and public servants altogether, like I don't think it's a secret that most public servants that we've engaged with know that they could be better. Like most of them probably already have the solution. You just got to talk to them.
Yeah.
And see what they think.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that there's people that probably like lost hope and like don't see a better way around it. Like you need both. You need the people that are already there because they know specifically where
Yep.
we get in our own way.
Yeah.
You also need external validators, folks that can come in and maybe just catapult and catalyze that innovation in the direction that you're seeing it. Those would be probably the three things I would think about.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the GovFresh podcast. To subscribe and find more episodes, visit podcast.govfresh.com.